A white cop points a gun at a black general at a funeral. His life ends behind bars. The first shot wasn't from the gun, it was from the camera. Someone's phone was already recording before the officer's finger even touched the trigger. The rain came down in thin silver threads, blurring the sight of the coffin draped in the American flag. Every droplet seemed to whisper the same accusation. How dare you? The mourners stood frozen, black umbrellas tilting as if the wind itself had stopped in shock. At the center of it all, General Marcus Hale, a man whose chest was a battlefield of medals and scars, stared down the barrel of a Glock in the trembling hands of Officer Derek Vance. Marcus had faced Taliban snipers at 200 yards, had survived an IED blast that left him limping for life. But he had never, not once, thought he'd be staring death in the face at the funeral of his own brother. On American soil, from a man sworn to protect it. Nobody moved. Nobody breathed. Vance's voice cracked the air like a whip. Hands where I can see them. Now, Marcus didn't move his hands. They were already visible open, palms forward, just above the coffin lid, as if in surrender to both God and man. The fact that they were empty didn't matter. Not to Vance. Not to the system that had raised him. It should have been about grief. The funeral should have been about David Hale, Marcus's younger brother, a soft-spoken EMT who had saved more lives than most police precincts combined. But David was black, and David was dead because 1 month ago, in an alley behind the gas station, he had been mistaken for a suspect. The officer who pulled the trigger was never charged. Marcus had flown back from his overseas command post just to bury him. And now, here they were, the living and the dead, the accused and the accuser, framed perfectly in the lens of an iPhone. From the far side of the coffin, a child's voice broke through the silence. Uncle Marcus? It was David's son, Elijah. His hand clutched the hem of his mother's coat. His eyes were wide, still too young to understand the full shape of the nightmare unfolding before him. Marcus swallowed, the taste of rain and gun oil mixing on his tongue. It's okay, Eli, he said softly. Everything's gonna be okay. But it wasn't. Behind the wall of mourners, more officers were closing in, their radios hissing with codes that Marcus knew too well. He recognized the stance, the circling pattern, the way their eyes never left his hands, as if they were waiting for him to twitch, to breathe wrong, to give them a reason. And Vance had that look, the kind that didn't see a decorated general, or a grieving brother, or even a human being. Just a threat. You're under arrest, Vance barked. For what? Marcus's voice was calm, low, the way you'd talk to a man holding a grenade with the pin half pulled. Step away from the coffin. The crowd murmured, anger swelling. Someone shouted, "This is a funeral, you sick." But another officer silenced them with a glare. Marcus took a slow breath, his eyes never leaving Vance's. "Officer," he said, "if you're going to shoot me, do it. But you and I both know this isn't about the law." The rain intensified, drumming on metal, wood, and flesh alike. Vance's jaw clenched. His knuckles whitened around the grip of his pistol. Somewhere deep inside him, a voice, the voice of his training, his father, his precinct, whispered the old lie. Control the threat. The threat is him. But there was another voice, quieter, and for a second, it almost broke through. Almost. That's when the sirens came. Not the ones you hear from a block away. These were close, loud, urgent. A black SUV skidded to a stop at the cemetery gate, and out stepped Colonel Sarah Monroe, Marcus's longtime friend and comrade in arms. She was still in her fatigues, the rain streaking across the desert camo pattern. "Vance," she barked, her voice cutting through the static-filled radios. "Stand down." That's an order. But Vance wasn't in the army. He wasn't under her command. He didn't lower his weapon. Instead, he took one small step closer to Marcus. And the crowd collectively gasped. The air was no longer just heavy with rain, it was thick with the stench of something older, something fouler. History. A history that had stalked men like Marcus for generations, bending knees, breaking backs, and now pressing the cold mouth of a gun against his life. Marcus didn't blink. His father had taught him that. Never look away from the man who might end you, make him see that you see him, that you are not invisible. Vance's boots squelched in the wet grass as he stepped closer. Water streamed down his temple, darkening the brim of his cap. His eyes were pale, almost glassy, the kind you'd see in a man who'd convinced himself the world was neatly divided into good and bad, us and them, and that them could be spotted by the color of their skin. The mourners shifted uneasily. Somewhere behind Marcus, a woman's voice whispered, "He's really going to do it." Colonel Monroe moved quickly, stepping between them, but Vance shoved her aside with his free arm. The move was sudden, ugly, and Marcus's instincts kicked and his hand twitched forward, not toward a weapon, but to steady Monroe before she fell. And that was it. That was all it took. Vance's eyes lit up. The threat had moved. The muzzle of the Glock rose half an inch. The crowd gasped as if they'd seen a lightning bolt split the ground. Marcus raised his voice, sharp enough to cut through the roar of the rain. "Stop. Look at my hands." Nothing there. But to Vance, those hands were never empty. They were loaded with every fear he'd been fed since childhood. Fear wrapped in uniforms, in police reports, in late-night locker room jokes, in his father's lessons about who the real criminals were. The radios crackled again. Backup units were on the way. Not to protect Marcus, to contain him. Marcus's mind was working faster than the scene unfolding. Every muscle wanted to act, but every thought screamed restraint. One wrong move, and this would end in a headline his mother would have to read. In the corner of his vision, he caught Elijah's face, pale, wet, trembling. And that's when Marcus decided, no, not here, not today, not like this. He slowly sank to one knee, palms still open, the coffin between him and Vance like a fragile wall of memory. His voice carried low, but firm. "Officer Vance, you're standing in a graveyard with a gun pointed at a man who's buried more soldiers than you've probably met. You want to arrest me? Fine. But if you pull that trigger, you're going to have to explain to every camera here why you murdered a general at his own brother's funeral." The phones were still rolling. Dozens of them. Vance's lip curled. He hated the cameras. He hated that people were watching, recording, turning this into something he couldn't control. And hate, Marcus knew, was just fear with its mask off. 2 more squad cars pulled up, tires hissing on wet asphalt. Officers in black rain ponchos advanced in a slow V formation, hands on weapons, eyes darting between Marcus and Vance as if unsure who the suspect was. Monroe tried again, stepping between them, her voice steady but urgent. "This isn't protocol, Vance. You know it. The man's unarmed, he's not resisting. Holster your weapon before you, shut it." Vance barked, his face twisting. "You don't know what he's capable of." Marcus let out a bitter laugh, the kind that comes when you've heard the same lie for the 1,000th time, and it still somehow manages to sting. "Yeah," Marcus said. "I'm capable of burying my brother without getting shot. Think you can let me do that?" The words landed hard. Even some of the officers flanking the scene looked away, ashamed. Then, from the crowd, a new voice cut through, deep, authoritative. "Vance, put the gun down. That's an order." It was Captain Reeves, Vance's direct superior, striding toward them with a grin set to his jaw. Reeves was white too, but his eyes were different, calculating, cautious, aware of the optics. "Sir, Vance began, but Reeves raised a hand. "No, I've seen the footage from last month. I know exactly who this man is, and I know exactly who you are. Stand down." For a moment, it looked like Vance might listen. His shoulders dropped a fraction, the Glock dipping just slightly. And then a shout from the crowd. "He's a murderer." It was an older man, face twisted with grief. David's godfather. The accusation wasn't aimed at Marcus. It was aimed at Vance. The word hit like a spark in dry grass. Vance's face flushed, his jaw locked, and before anyone could stop him, he stepped forward, pressing the gun's muzzle within inches of Marcus's forehead. The gasp from the crowd was deafening. Phones shook in trembling hands. Marcus didn't move. He just stared into the rain-slick eyes in front of him and said one word. "Coward." The syllable landed like a stone in still water, rippling outward into the stunned silence. And then, as if the tension had reached its breaking point, Reeves lunged, his hand clamping down on Vance's wrist. The gun jerked upward, the shot splitting the air like a crack of thunder, harmlessly shattering a branch overhead. Screams erupted. Elijah sobbed. Monroe grabbed Marcus, pulling him back toward the safety of the mourners. Officers swarmed Vance, wrestling him to the ground, their boots splashing in the mud. The next minutes were chaos, flashing lights, shouted orders, the metallic click of handcuffs. Vance's face was a storm of rage and humiliation as Reeves read him his rights. "You're making a mistake." Vance spat. "He's dangerous. You don't know what I know enough." Reeves cut him off, shoving him toward the squad car. Marcus stood in the rain, chest rising and falling, his dress uniform soaked through. Monroe placed a hand on his shoulder, grounding him in the swirl of sirens and whispers. "You okay?" she asked. "No," Marcus said honestly. "But I'm alive. And right now, that's enough." But Marcus knew this wasn't the end. The footage would spread. The headlines would twist. Somewhere in a newsroom, someone would already be deciding whether to call him decorated war hero or controversial figure. And somewhere in a holding cell, Derek Vance would be plotting the story he'd tell to save himself. Because men like Vance never think they're the villain. By nightfall, Marcus's face was on every screen in America. The footage, shaky, grainy, rain-streaked, had gone viral before the last mourner even left the cemetery. Headlines blared across networks, some echoing outrage, others dripping with suspicion. Decorated black general confronted at brother's funeral. Officer draws weapon in cemetery standoff. Was this police overreach or a prevented threat? The split was immediate. For every voice calling Vance a racist thug, another called Marcus aggressive or noncompliant. Some talked about his military record with reverence. Others dug up old mission reports, trying to paint him as violent in war zones. Marcus had seen propaganda before, but it hit different when it was your name in the crosshairs. The next morning, he sat at his mother's kitchen table, the same one where she'd served pancakes before school when he and David were kids. Now it was buried under newspapers, tablets, and half-empty coffee mugs. Monroe sat across from him, scrolling through an endless feed of hot takes and comment threads. "They're already spinning it," she said. "The union's backing Vance. Claims he had credible intel you were armed." Marcus let out a dry laugh. "Intel? At a funeral?" Guess the flowers looked suspicious. His mother, Evelyn, hovered by the stove, her hands restless. She'd barely spoken since the cemetery. Her eyes were rimmed red not just from David's death, but from the fresh wound of watching another son nearly join him. "They're going to try to destroy you," she said quietly. "They can't let a black man walk away from something like this without paying a price." Marcus reached for her hand. "They can try." Meanwhile, Derek Vance sat in a holding cell, his knee bouncing with restless energy. The walls felt too close, the fluorescent light too harsh. His lawyer, a slick-haired man in an expensive suit named Carl Denning, sat across from him with a legal pad. "Okay, Derek," Denning said. "First thing we do is control the narrative. You weren't targeting him because he's black, you were responding to a threat." "There was a threat," Vance snapped. "The guy twitched, I saw it." Denning raised an eyebrow. "On camera?" Vance's jaw tightened. "No, but I know what I saw. My old man always told me you hesitate around certain types, you end up dead." Denning scribbled something down. "All right, so we'll frame it as officer safety. You perceived, I didn't just perceive it." Vance slammed his fist against the table. "He's dangerous. You should have seen the look in his eyes." Denning gave a tight smile, the kind reserved for clients who were both a meal ticket and a PR nightmare. "Let me handle the optics, Derek. We'll get you out of this." Within a week, the case became a national obsession. News anchors dissected the footage frame by frame. Experts debated whether Vance's draw was reasonable force or blatant racial profiling. Hashtags trended: funeral standoff, justice for Marcus, blue shield down. Marcus was summoned to testify before an internal review board. He wore his uniform not for show, but because it reminded him who he was, and because he knew the cameras would be rolling. In the cramped hearing room, Vance sat at the opposite table, glaring at him like a man who'd been robbed of something. Denning whispered into his ear between questions, feeding him lines. The board's lead investigator, a sharp-eyed woman named Ada Clark, addressed Marcus first. "General Hale, did you at any point threaten Officer Vance or any other officers on scene?" "No, ma'am." "Did you make any sudden or aggressive movements before Officer Vance drew his weapon?" "No, ma'am. I stood by my brother's coffin. My hands were visible the entire time." Clark nodded, then turned to Vance. "Officer, what specific action led you to believe General Hale was a threat?" Vance hesitated, glancing at Denning. He moved suddenly, reached toward the coffin like he was going for something. Marcus spoke up. "I reached to steady a woman after he shoved her." The room went still. Clark raised an eyebrow. "Colonel Monroe?" Monroe, seated in the gallery, stood. "That's correct. He shoved me. The general kept me from falling." Vance's face twitched. Denning leaned in, whispering furiously. The review board wasn't the final trial, but it was a preview. Public sentiment was already tilting, especially when a new angle of cell phone footage surfaced, clearly showing Monroe's stumble and Marcus's helping hand. Cable news played it on repeat. Vance's defenders began to thin. Still, the police union dug in, accusing Marcus of military intimidation and weaponizing his status. They hired PR firms to smear him. An op-ed accused him of staging the moment for political gain. Marcus ignored the noise, but the noise didn't ignore him. Protesters began showing up outside his mother's house, some holding signs of support, others with slogans like "Back the Blue" and "Traitors wear stars." One night, a brick smashed through the front window. The note attached read, "Next time we won't miss." 2 months later, the criminal trial began. The courthouse steps were a battlefield of slogans and shouting. On one side, activists demanded Vance's conviction. On the other, officers and their supporters claimed the system was sacrificing one of their own to appease the mob. Inside, the tension was even sharper. Marcus took the stand on the third day. The prosecutor led him through the events, step by step. His voice was steady, his answers clear. Then came Denning's cross-examination. "You've killed people before, haven't you, General?" Denning asked, pacing like a predator. Marcus didn't flinch. "In combat zones, yes. In defense of my unit and my country. And would you agree, sir, that you are a physically imposing man? That an officer might reasonably see you as dangerous?" "I'd agree," Marcus said slowly. "That racism often disguises itself as reasonable fear." A murmur rippled through the courtroom. Denning smirked, but it didn't reach his eyes. Midway through the trial, the defense played a bodycam clip from another officer, one that hadn't been widely shared. In it, Vance could be heard muttering under his breath before confronting Marcus. Another one of them thinking he's above the law. The words were faint, but clear enough. The gallery gasped. The prosecutor pounced. "Officer Vance, who exactly did you mean by them?" Vance shifted in his seat. "Soldiers. Arrogant types." "Soldiers," the prosecutor repeated, "or black men." Vance's silence was louder than any denial. By the time closing arguments began, the outcome felt inevitable to everyone but Vance. The jury saw the videos, heard the witnesses, and weighed the intent. When the verdict came guilty on multiple counts, including assault with a deadly weapon under color of authority, Marcus didn't smile. Evelyn cried softly beside him. Monroe placed a steady hand on his back. Vance's face twisted as the bailiff moved to escort him away. His eyes locked on Marcus one last time. "This isn't over," he hissed. Marcus met his gaze. "For you it is." Derek Vance's first week in prison was a crash course in humility. The walls weren't just made of concrete, they were made of stairs. Men watched him with the slow, predatory gaze of people who had nothing but time. His uniform had been replaced by an orange jumpsuit, his badge stripped away, but the way he carried himself rigid, alert, screamed, "Cop," to everyone in the block. And in prison, that was a scent that drew sharks. On the third day, someone slipped a note under his cell door. "Welcome to the other side of the law." By the second week, he'd been in 2 fights. The first ended with a split lip, the second with a cracked rib. The guards didn't rush to help. Most of them knew who he was and what he'd done. Some had even watched the footage. In here, his authority meant nothing. He learned fast that survival meant silence. No boasting, no backtalk. Just keep your head down and your hands to yourself. But silence left him alone with his thoughts. And in the long, sleepless nights, the cemetery scene replayed over and over. Sometimes he told himself he'd been right. Other times, he saw Elijah's wide, terrified eyes and wondered if maybe, just maybe, he'd been wrong. On the outside, the trial's shockwaves hadn't faded. The video of Vance's conviction became a rallying cry for reform. Civil rights groups pushed for stronger accountability laws. Police departments across the country were forced to review use of force policies. Not everyone celebrated. Protesters still clashed in the streets. Politicians argued on talk shows. But something had shifted, a crack in the shield of impunity. Marcus didn't watch most of it. Instead, he returned to his duties for a final year before retiring. He moved quietly, refusing interviews, declining book deals, ignoring offers from political parties who wanted to use him as a symbol. He told Monroe once, over coffee, "Symbols are easy to praise. People are harder to change." It was nearly a year after the funeral when Marcus received a letter with no return address. The handwriting was rough, the words uneven. General Hale, I'm not asking for forgiveness. I don't think I deserve it. I've had a lot of time to think in here, and I keep coming back to that day. I told myself it was training, instinct, survival. But the truth is, I saw your skin before I saw your hands. And that's on me. I don't expect you to write back. I just needed to say it out loud before it rots me from the inside. Vance Marcus read it twice, then set it down. For a long time, he just stared at the folded paper. Evelyn found him at the kitchen table. From him, she asked. He nodded. You gonna answer? Marcus thought about it. About David, about Elijah, about the dozens of funerals he'd attended for soldiers of every color. About the years of being looked at as a threat first and a man second. Finally, he said, not yet. 3 months later, Marcus stood outside the gates of Redfield Correctional Facility. He'd asked for the meeting. Vance had agreed. Inside, the visiting room was bright but cold, lit by buzzing fluorescent tubes. Vance shuffled in, thinner than Marcus remembered, his jumpsuit hanging loose on his frame. They sat across from each other. No cameras, no press, just two men with too much history between them. You came, Vance said. Marcus nodded. I read your letter. Vance looked down at his hands. I meant it. I don't know what else to say. You don't have to say anything, Marcus replied. But I needed you to hear something from me. Vance looked up, wary. I don't forgive you, Marcus said plainly. Not yet. Maybe not ever. But I don't hate you. Hate's too easy. You think pulling that trigger would have been the end of me? It wouldn't. But it was the end of you. The second you let prejudice make your decision, you lost everything. And you did it to yourself. Vance swallowed hard. I know. Marcus stood. You're gonna live with that. Every day? That's your sentence, no matter how many years they give you. Vance didn't try to stop him as he left. Outside, the winter air cut sharp against Marcus's face. He walked slowly toward the parking lot, feeling the weight of the meeting settle into something quieter than anger. When he got home, Elijah was waiting for him in the yard, holding a football. Want to play, Uncle Marcus? Marcus smiled. Yeah, let's play. And as the boy ran across the grass, laughter breaking through the cold, Marcus thought maybe this was how healing started. Not with forgiveness, not with forgetting, but with refusing to let the past write the rest of your life. 6 months later, Vance was transferred to a medium security facility. His name faded from the headlines. The world moved on, as it always did. But every so often, a guard would slide a newspaper under his door, an article about another department changing its rules, another officer held accountable, another protest that didn't end in silence. And every time, Vance would stare at the stories, feeling the dull ache of the truth he'd learned too late. The world he'd tried to control was changing without him. For Marcus, the change was slower, more personal. He joined a small advocacy group for veterans who'd faced racial discrimination in service. He spoke at schools, not about war, but about dignity, about seeing the human being before the uniform or the skin. One day, Monroe asked him if he thought the system could ever really change. He took a long time before answering. I think people can. And if enough people change, maybe the system doesn't have a choice. Years later, when Marcus was gone, Elijah would tell his own children about his uncle, the man who faced a gun at a funeral and walked away, not because he was fearless, but because he refused to let fear dictate his actions. And maybe that was the legacy Marcus wanted all along. Not to be remembered as a victim, not even as a hero, but as a man who stood his ground without pulling the trigger. That was the ending the headlines never wrote. And maybe that's why it mattered most. Thank you for listening. If you find it interesting, please like and subscribe to follow the next stories.